Of course there was quite a lot of controversy when we were established way back in 2006 for all sorts of reasons. But one of those was that we would shift the funding environment away from basic research to the more applied end and the more clinical type stuff. But actually that hasn't happened. I think we've had quite a collaborative approach to research in the UK. We might reflect upon the degree to which that collaboration, how healthy it is at the moment. But that hasn't happened, and I think actually NIHR has been a very important feature, new feature to the health research landscape. Thank you. Gosh, it's almost instinctive now. So I was talking about the broad public relationship. So actually, this is a slide that went up to the new minister when he came on board a few months ago. I'm not going to say anything about understanding visuals more than words, but anyway, we thought it would be an easy way for him to grasp that over the years, we've put in a real range of activities all about trying to build that very broad relationship with the public. So everything from online tools by which people can access information about research, to campaigns, to our work around Involve. And I'm going to touch on a little bit of each of these. But essentially the message is our relationship is a broad one, and we're constantly trying to nurture that and find new ways to engage with it and to involve with it. But it's not difficult. And actually, it's not easy as a government funder to do because the work we do in this room, the work we're all talking about in this room, suffers from chronic underinvestment actually, wherever you look, local and national. So I'm very supportive of NIHR, obviously, but a lot of the work that we do suffers from under-resourcing generally, and we might want to talk about that a bit later. Next slide. Thank you very much. You really are good. So what's been our approach to public involvement in the NIHR? So I often talk about our history with it as culture change, and I think public involvement is about culture change. It's about changing the ways and the behaviours within a system. And so I think many of the things that we've got right, you would find in a textbook, article or description of how culture change should work. And I think for us, the key elements have been as follows. So, number one, we've had really strong leadership around public involvement from the top. So from day one, 2006, our Chief Medical Officer, who was in charge of NIHR, was willing to say things like this to the academic community. It's the rule, not the exception. We are going to do public involvement. You are going to be expected to do this as part of what you do. That's a very strong and bold statement. It wasn't liked at all, but actually it was very important from a patient and public perspective that we felt that we had someone at the top who was going to go into bat for us. So I think you have to have leadership at many, many levels, but the organisations that really struggle with it are those that don't have buy-in at the very top. The ones where the leader won't turn up and say, actually I support public involvement and we're going to do it. That's when it begins to become a lot harder instantaneously. The second one is we did commit to involve the public at every step. So, and yes, there's a sort of pragmatic, practical element to that. But there's also a very strong element to us, which is about saying, you know what, this thing called research excellence, it's not something that sits over here and the public involvement sits over here. We see public involvement as actually integral to our definition of research excellence. For us, research excellence can't happen unless you have public involvement as part of that. Now, I'm not saying that in the actual doing of things, sometimes that falls apart, but actually that's our aspiration, to see those things to come closer together and much more aligned. And way back in 2006, again, that was a very controversial thing to be saying and doing. The next one is we've set very clear expectations with our community that, again, this is what we expect from them around public involvement. So if you are a research team or an individual researcher or an institution coming to us for funding, part of the application process, you'll be expected to demonstrate how you've involved the public in generating your application, i.e. thinking about the idea and formulating the idea. You'll be expected to write what your plan is for involving the public over the course of your funding, and then if and when you get the funding, you'll be expected to describe how that's worked and what you've achieved and what the impacts have been. And we monitor and evaluate and look at that as part of the way that we assess and evaluate them as our funding recipients. Now, it's quite interesting, and again, we were talking about it yesterday, that in many respects, some of this isn't mandated, but what's been, I think, clever about the NIHR approach is that we've asked the question in many, many different ways at many different points at which people engage with us. So they've started to change their behaviour to meet that expectation. However, over time, we have begun to mandate those elements of public involvement that we think are absolutely critical and which we think have a knock-on effect further down the line to public understanding of research. So to give you just one example of that, many of you will know the importance of a plain English, or what we might call a lay summary of research. And actually, quite often when you look at applications, they're very poor, and actually the description is almost impenetrable, not just to the layperson or the public, but actually to the fellow scientists. And I've sat in many committee rooms where people say, I'm really glad you asked that question, Simon, because I haven't got a clue what they're talking about either. So we decided in May 2015 to actually mandate the fact that you have to have a good plain English summary as part of your application, which has been reviewed and passed, if you like, by our lay people who are part of that programme board or part of that review panel. And that if you don't have a good lay summary, you don't get your check, basically. So unless it's there and it's in existence, you're not going to get your money. And of course, that's a very powerful motivation for people to sit down and take the time to write good English summary of their research. And we think that's important because when it comes time to report that or to put it out there to the wider public, actually you can see that emanate into better communication and better messages and more responsible messaging and perhaps handling of the media around that science. So we are mandating bits of it, and I suppose our aspiration is begin to have actual contractual clauses around public involvement in due course, and I'll come back to that perhaps later. Our spirit has been to do this in partnership and collaboration. I know many people on the patient side would perhaps want us to go quicker and faster and perhaps mandate a few things, but we've a few more and be a bit more stick rather than a carrot. But we're very much of the view that the only way to do this, to make it long-lasting and to make it stick within the system, is through partnership and collaboration. And actually, and I think what NIHR has done is prove that to some extent. Every part of our system also has some capability and capacity now for public involvement. So it doesn't matter whether you're in our furthest flung part of NIHR or you're near to the centre, you will often see there being a public involvement lead, what we call a lead. They might be doing it as part of something else, but they will be someone who's paid to take forward public involvement, and typically a group, advisory group, or community that's aligned around that institution and helping them further their work. So it's quite difficult to gauge what our community is, but I would say that we've got around 250 people who are salaried and are promoting public involvement across the NIHR system with our external partners, and probably a community of people who are really working closely with us, i.e. sitting on groups, doing lay reviews, of many, many thousands up and down the country. So it's built into quite a significant community. Next slide. And as I was sort of saying, everything we do threads through, public involvement threads through every single activity. So I just wanted to use this as an example of setting a clear expectation. Some of you may be aware of this programme grant at NIHR. I think we might be into the third round of this programme grant now. But what you would expect to see if you went and visited that programme team was evidence that they've involved the public in terms of the development of the original grant application, but also how they're doing it. And actually, last Friday when I was looking at it, I saw that they actually had service users as part of their research team, co-applicants, etc., etc. And that's now becoming very, very common actually in terms of NIHR-funded projects and grants. Next slide. So at the hub of this fairly sort of complex picture, there isn't a head office anywhere in the UK that you can call NIHR and you walk into and then everybody's there. It's all over the place. But there is a hub for public involvement and it's called Involve, and it's situated on the south coast. its origins go way back to 1996. We're now into the sort of third contract with NIHR, so once we finish this one, it will be 15 years of consecutive funding from the government. It has a budget of around £700,000 a year. I'll let you translate that into Canadian dollars. Critically important organisation involved because but it's had to change with the time. So when we started in 2006, it was the only kid on the block. Of course, now we've got other centres, also with significant public involvement teams. So it's had to sort of change a little bit about how it operates. Also, what's slightly difficult for it is it's got 1 foot in government, all its money comes from government, and 1 foot out of government. So it has to play that very difficult role of ensuring constant credibility with the patient community, whilst also servicing a quite complex NIHR system. And by and large, I think we've got that right, but it can be quite a tense relationship, actually. And I think probably it's to its credit that many people out there in the community actually think it's an independent body, because I think it has got that voice bit pretty well right for many, many years. Not always, but I think more often than not. So I suppose there's 3 features to its work at the moment. One is we've given it some leadership areas to pursue, so significant pieces of work and public involvement that it needs to take forward. So diversity and inclusion is one of those. Learning and development is another one. We've got a lot of, I think, desire to do better at giving researchers, but also patients and the public, better learning and development opportunities. I suppose its bread and butter is the briefings, the guidance, the helpline, all that sort of stuff, practical advice and help to people who are trying to do public involvement. And we've noticed that that's risen exponentially over the last 2 years. So we're getting a lot of inquiries now. We think that's a sign of the degree to which public involvement is becoming certainly much more vibrant part of the discourse around research than it ever was. And that's a good news, it's a good sign that things may be on the verge of changing. But it's obviously quite a lot to deal with. And then we're also trying to set up regional networks. Clearly we have a smaller country than you do, but we do have sparse populations and diverse populations and very local identities. So we've been in the process of setting up regional networks, collaboratives of patient groups and organisations working on research, all trying to and desiring to pursue public involvement in that area and actually working together. And that came out of a review which we found that was a lot of people who were could only be 10 miles apart, but who were doing the same work around public involvement but had never spoken to one another. It seemed like a huge waste of time, energy and money. So we're trying to correct that with these regional networks. Next slide, please. So for us, but however, it's important not to forget, for us, this is a strategically important thing to do. So we're not just, we are doing it because it's the right thing to do, it's the morally right thing to do. And we are doing it because we think it makes better research, but we are also doing it because we think it impacts on our bottom line as one of the major funders in the world. So there's a whole agenda around adding value to research, which is the polite way of saying reducing waste in research. A series of articles that's been in The Lancet about different ways of doing that, which one feature of which is the public being involved in setting priorities, because the better your priorities align to population need, then the less likelihood you're going to do research that's perhaps not going to be used or uptake in the future. So a series of Lancet articles. The last one was in March, and they looked at government funders who've been according to certain indices around adding value, one of which was public involvement. And you'll see that because of that, not just because of that, but because of that, NIHR is at the top of that league table. For us, we feel it pushes up that league table of world-class funders. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about the impacts. And impact's an interesting issue. It's a very, very active area of debate in the UK. I think people are rightly asking us for more and more evidence of the impact. I think, however, it's an interesting debate because, one, I think we have to respect and understand actually that we are a relatively new field. So we won't have legions of books or academic papers, but nonetheless we do have to generate that evidence and those examples as quickly as we can, and we are trying to do that, and we actually are about to start a whole piece of work around the impact. But let me tell you in broad terms where we see the biggest impacts for us as a government funder. So next slide, please. So the first one is in terms of, and I suppose the thing I would say before that is that we are also very keen on trying to convey a philosophy to our researchers of what I would call principled pragmatism, rather. So yes, we have very strong values and principles around public involvement, but for us this is not something about trying to smother it everywhere and smother the work. This is about working with researchers and health professionals to identify the place in which public involvement is going to have most impact in the work that you were trying to do. And so that points to, it's a very important message from us, having those early discussions, a bit like you're going to have around your Dragon's Den, with patients and the public about, okay, so where is the point at which public involvement is going to have make most difference to what you're doing? Because actually that's what patients and the public also want to focus on. They don't want to be crawling all over this piece of work. They've got busy lives living with a condition. They've got busy lives coping with a family or managing a family. So they actually want to focus their time and attention on the things that are really going to matter most to making the research good research. So that preliminary discussion, if you like, is really, really, really critical. Next slide, please. Next slide. So, the impacts. I think there are sort of three broad ones that we would talk about. The first one is this ensuring research relevance, and this goes to Dean's point about priority setting and agenda setting. And the principal mechanism for us has been through what we call James Linderline's priority setting partnerships. I don't know how many people have heard of these in the room, but they're now a very popular mechanism in the UK. In essence, they enable patients and public and health professionals to come together and identify the top 10 research priorities in that particular condition area. And I'll come back on to what I mean by condition area in a minute. And so started in 2006. First one was in asthma, was really difficult, nearly failed actually, took 2 years to complete. But 10, 11 years now on, we've had 50 completed priority setting partnerships, everything from asthma to bipolar disease to disorder to depression. Some of these are very big exercises now and often supported by charities but hosted by NIHR. So the depression one was actually done by a charity called MQ Transforming Mental Health, along with a partnership with other mental health charities. I think it had something like 8,000 or 9,000 people who took part in the initial survey to identify research priorities or research issues that matter to them. And then by a process of workshops and dialogue, you begin to narrow it down until you've got your top 10. Very good one actually happening, just started in the UK around young people's mental health. It's a very good video and animation out there that the young people have done themselves about advertising that topic. And it continues to be very popular. So we've got about 40 active ones at the moment, and they're now beginning to branch out not just into other conditions, many other conditions, but also into things like, we've got one about to start on what the research priorities in the social work profession, for instance, or what's the research priorities in particular forms of caregiving within residential homes. So they're beginning to branch out into the service environment, which is something I've always wanted to see them do. So for us as a funder, if you go back to 10 years, we would have a scientific opinion and voice pretty well worked out. We're in day-to-day dialogue with them, but we've never really had that thing, that counterpoint to say, this is what patients in that area, this is what health professionals in that area think the research should look like. And I think for us, having those two things together enables us to have a much more balanced portfolio going forward. I'm not saying it's very easy bringing those things together, but at least we now have a balanced view of what the world looks like there in terms of priorities. And part of the challenge for these, I think, is ensuring not just NIHR, but other funders follow through on those priorities. Next slide, please. The next one is, I think we're seeing ever better work showing us where public involvement actually impacts on the design and delivery of research. So this is quite an interesting paper in the British Journal of Obs and Gynae, and actually this research group tried to set out the research process in a linear fashion and identify all the potential points at which the public could be involved and could input into it. What we found along this research process, a couple of things. Next slide. So the first is that the earlier you do public involvement, the better. So everything that we get back from both researchers and patients and public is, the sooner you do it in this process, the more likely the impact is going to be good and helpful. And if you try and do it halfway along, it's probably too late. It's quite difficult to correct things at that point. So that's when you have things like Dragon's Den exercises, why they're very important. Jaffa cakes, I don't know whether you have Jaffa cakes in Canada, which is a very popular biscuit in the UK, but Jaffa cakes is actually the name of a group in the south of England, an intergenerational group, young and old, as young as 16, as old as 86, who do a Dragon's Den with their researchers in a hospital on the south coast of England. And it's very positive, and now that's very prevalent across the UK, that sort of exercise. Next slide. A lot of the impact you'll see in public involvement is around patient information leaflets, designing protocols. In the early days of the networks, we had our young people work very closely with pharmaceutical companies to rewrite their protocols and their patient information leaflets so that they were better, easier to understand for families and young people. And then we've also tried to sort of change the philosophy of some of our science so that rather than expecting people to come into a hospital to do it, we'll go out there. So this is a study which is about testing hearing aids in infants. They had parents to advise that group about how they should do the study, and they said, well, actually, no, it's really difficult for me and for any other young mother or young father to come into the hospital every week with all the other things going on for them. So why don't you come to us? So they now have this van that goes around to go and visit families to do the hearing aid tests there. I mean, it's common sense, but of course, common sense often gets lost in the scheme of trying to meet a particular, scientific, bureaucratic process that funders, including NIHR, will often set up. Okay, next one. And we do see strengthening performance for us. So one of the big things for us in the UK is something called time to target, and the efficiency with which we recruit to clinical trials. And we've done several studies looking at the association between public involvement and the impact on that performance. This was the first one and perhaps the most compelling in mental health. We looked at all the studies that we've done in mental health over 5 years, and we found that those who had mutuality, a culture of mutuality between the research team and the service users, were about 4 times more likely to hit their targets than those that didn't. And I think that's quite powerful evidence. Again, it needs to be supported by more inquiry. And actually, if you get this right, it can have an impact on your bottom line as well, and the cost of what you're doing. Next slide. So a big part of our work has also been to focus on getting access to research through the NHS much more visible to patients. So if you go into our hospitals, something that we get commonly reported by people that we ask on the street is, I don't know, I didn't know my local hospital did research. It's complete news to me. I would expect them to do it, but I've never seen a sign up. No one's ever asked me to do that. We've done mystery shopper exercises that really upset our NHS chief executives, but actually basically showed them that none of them were telling their patients and the public that they did research, and therefore patients weren't being offered it as a choice as part of their care pathway. So that's what this drive to doing more around access to research in the NHS is about. I'm just going to tell you very briefly, I'm conscious of the time, about one aspect. Next slide. Is something called patient research ambassadors. So these are patients, carers, they can be members of the public, who are embedded with, if you like, they're volunteers, they embed themselves in the trust under the face of research with other patients. So they can do everything from sitting with the R&D manager and designing a recruitment strategy locally to actually, staffing an information stand in a reception area and meeting and greeting people and telling them about research and why it's important and why they do it. These guys, John and Alan, who are like the Starsky and Hutch of research in the east of England, they spent International Clinical Trials Day last year. They went around every ward and they spoke to every single patient about research. And of course the hospital love them because they're not just talking about research, they're also playing a really important social function, because there are many people in those wards who never get a visitor, who never have a conversation with anybody except the clinical or the health professional staff. So actually they've become a really important part of the community, and part of making research normal is making research part of the overall hospital or primary care community. Next slide. And now I think we're turning to a big issue for us, which is about results. So, and you can press the next one as well. So we're very poor, very, very poor at one, sharing results with patients who've been through trials, and also thanking people. So our next big piece of work, I think, around this Access to Zenjo is about getting this sharing of results and getting the thank you much, much better and much more consistent and regular across our system. And so we do patient experience surveys to sort of gauge the degree to how that might happen, and we're doing some digital work to see whether we can do something through apps or texting to enable people to go to a clinical research appointment to get a thank you and to be reminded of their next appointment and things like that. So trying to think about it more as people are going to hate this word in the room, but a sort of consumer relationship at this end of what's happening. Okay, so a few minutes. I'm conscious of the yellow signs going up. What does the future hold for us? I think a few things really. One is it's about trying to continue to embed this into what NIHR does, but also much broader. So this is a changing landscape, however. There is new things coming along. There are some things that, for those of us who've been around long enough, they're coming around again. You know, in the UK, we're not talking about involvement so much, we're talking about co-production and co-design. Those are the things that everybody's talking about. No one can define them to you, but everyone's very excited about them. So, you know, what does that actually mean? How do you do things in a co-produced way? We're not thinking so much about the individual in a committee room, which is largely what NIHR started doing, and more thinking about, you know, community, digital, how do we do those things? How do we use these new devices? We're also thinking very much about going from a more sort of clinical focus, and you're absolutely right if you've observed that most of what I've talked about is around the clinical trial sphere, to something that's much, much more about health research, including public health and social care, which have not, I think, benefited from the same support and funding over the past 10 years as other parts. So this is changing all the time, and we have to be conscious of, reflective of that, and actually more than reflective, I want public involvement to be driving where this goes and where some of the answers crop up. Next slide, please. 2 years ago we did a strategic review called Going the Extra Mile, partly to try and sort of embrace these changes. And there are many different recommendations in that around learning and development, diversity, inclusion, but one of those was to establish some standards for public involvement. So a lot that we got back from people was, we don't know what good looks like. Well, what does good public involvement look like? Patients would say to us, I've been asked to go into this, you know, institute and work with them, but I don't know what they're expecting of me, and I've had 3 meetings and I still don't know. And the researchers from the same project, they say, I don't really know, you know, what to expect of them, and I don't know what they expect of me. So there's a whole piece of the dialogue that's not working out there. So we recommended that we should produce some standards that people could use to self-certify themselves across NIHR around public involvement, and in time we would embed them in our contractual culture, so enable us to measure and evaluate them, but not in a sort of regulatory fashion, but just in an encouraging way. So, next slide. We started off with some values around public involvement, which were all co-designed with patients and the public and others, which you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen. And over a period of 6 months of further dialogue and work, we've turned them into what we call our draft public involvement standards. So I'll just go to the next slide. The first is around inclusiveness, inclusive opportunities. The second is around working together. The third is around support and learning. Then communications, impact, and governance. And each of these has 4 or 5 indicators of what good looks like in that scenario. So we've just finished the public consultation with those. We've had about 700 responses, about 21% from researchers, about 50% from the public. patronage public members of what we do across NIHR. And the next step for us is to refine those. I wouldn't be surprised if we put one ahead of all those, which is around purpose. Why